What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are jumping into Aquaman Rebirth with Underworld. And what we're going to do for the next few weeks is we're actually going to kind of double up on these so that we can get them up all the way to Drowned Earth, which is actually looks pretty amazing, Justice League and Aquaman. But picking up with this, one thing to bear in mind is, remember, in the last video last video that we did, we had basically talked about how Aquaman had been overthrown from Atlantis, that you had Wrath, who led a group called the Deluge, which was really just like a terrorist cell. But Wrath was the leader of it, and then they in turn overthrew Arthur Curry. And then because of the fact that the various people who serve under Arthur Curry serve the throne and not really Aquaman himself. So like Commander Merc himself was tasked with killing Aquaman and supposedly successfully did it, basically stabbed him through the back. And so following this, it's really been like a couple weeks since Wrath has taken power. And at this point, he's consolidating his forces together. And things are kind of crazy because what this does is this picks up initially with the idea of the Ninth Tribe. Now that's one of the cool things about what Dan Abnett's doing is there's a lot of expansion that's going on with the Atlantean mythos in DC Rebirth as a whole. And it's really, really cool to see because what we end up doing is transitioning to the Ninth Tribe itself. We end up having Arthur Curry, who's still alive and well, as we would expect him to be. It wouldn't be much of an Aquaman title if he's dead, but he's basically sitting down here in the Ninth Tribe. And what he tells us is the Ninth Tribe it's almost like the levels of hell, so to speak, from Dante's Inferno, from Dante's Divine Comedy. The Ninth Tribe is the lowest level. And so that's basically for like undesirables, for mutants, for people who are deemed to be the lowest caste of society. But more so than that, is for people to hide out at. And so what we end up doing is kind of transitioning to a guy named Volko. Now Volko he's been part of the Aquaman mythos for a while. In New 52, he was the one that essentially sparked like the Throne of Atlantis story, where you ended up having like the War of Atlantis, where you had Aquaman's brother who attacked the surface world, and that led to the great big huge conflict and so on and so forth. But he's a guy who's been in Atlantis for a long time, and he knows a lot of things. And he's one of those where even if he's not liked by everybody, people know who he is. And so him showing up here and talking to people is basically saying, look, we have to strike while the iron's hot. We have to find a way to overthrow Wrath. The problem with this is that Volko's looked at as a guy who will use people for his own ends. And so people don't really trust him per se. The other half of this is that you have the Crown of Thorns, which surrounds Atlantis, and it uses very old magic that cannot be penetrated using like raw strength or anything like that. And so for the most part, they're stuck down there. Not only that, because of the fact that Wrath, people like, his leadership don't really venture down into the Ninth Tribe, what they do is they use the Ninth Tribe to police itself. Now for Arthur himself, for Aquaman, he just kind of says, well, I'm not who you think I am. I'm just some guy who's here. And he's basically trying to stay under the radar. And so what this does is it switches over to Amnesty Bay for a minute or two. Now, it's not a great big huge thing, but it does switch over to Amnesty Bay, and you've got Mera who's dealing with the perceived death of her husband. And that's one of the important things to bear in mind is that while Mera is presented to us oftentimes in DC Comics as a character who's pretty hardcore, and she's also a woman, and she's also a person who loves, and she reacts to the world accordingly. And so it's cool to basically humanize her in that regard, to say like, this is a loving, thinking, breathing human woman, not really a human woman, but like, a woman with human feelings and emotions and thoughts and ideas. She is, as we would perceive her to be, a human as we think of a human being. And so the result is she functions in all the same capacities, and she grieves just like any other wife who's ever lost her husband. And so in this moment, what Arthur starts doing is he actually starts drawing on Batman. This is a genius idea. He starts drawing on the nature of Batman and says, well, in Gotham City, Batman is more of a myth, or not really a myth, but he's more of like a legend. He's a thing to be feared. He's a symbol. No one knows who Batman is. He uses fear, he uses intimidation, and he uses shock in order to keep Gotham in line. So I will do that too. And so kind of operating in the Ninth Tribe, kind of like this mini Gotham City of Atlantis, basically Aquaman starts using fear and he starts using shock in order to get people to do what he wants to do, or at the very least, to back off and to basically protect the various people who are down there. And what this starts to do is it starts to build up this myth of the Aquaman, that there's a person down there that's protecting them. Now, the other half of this is that with Wrath beginning to kind of lose faith in like the ability of the Ninth Tribe to govern itself, he in turn starts tasking the Drift with going down there and wiping out mutants wherever he finds them. And so what you end up having is like this chick named Dolphin, who basically ends up fighting against some of the Drift, some of the elite forces of the Atlantean army. And then in turn, in the middle of all that, when the Drift is going to kill them all, you have Aquaman who shows up and basically saves the day. But he ends up kind of grabbing the attention of Dolphin. And then from there, she essentially seems to be smitten with him. That's really what kind of seems to be going on. Now, while all that's going on, what you have is Volko breaking, or really kind of breaking into the Silent School, which is where like a lot of the magic is taught in Atlantis, and then using one of their artifacts to essentially like make a phone call to Mera and do the best he can to tell her Aquaman's alive. He doesn't finish the sentence. Mera knows what he's saying, and she says Aquaman's alive. We have to go and find him. And so it's a really, really cool moment here, because from this point, you really start to get into like a lot of the history of the Aquaman mythos with a lot of different things that are going on, but a lot of the powers that various people possess. With Aquaman fighting alongside Dolphin, she has bioluminescence. And what this basically means is she can let off like an extremely bright light that can basically blind anybody in an immediate vicinity. But we'll also find out she can control it in a more fine-tuned way later on down the line. For Mera's character, her idea is to try to break through the crown of thorns. And while she does have the ability to like control water using a telekinetic ability more or less, she can't quite break through it. And that's something that Kormrath knows, and that's why he doesn't stress about it. Now at that point going forward, this is when we start to get into like the real underbelly of Atlantis. And it's something that we don't usually see. It basically says there's this whole other segment. You know, you have Atlantis way up there at the top. You have like the first tribe, basically like the first house. And then way down here, you've got like little hiding rooms, you've got little shelters, you've got like these subsects of people who are trying to make their way, who are basically just kind of struggling and doing the best they can under like this really crappy circumstance, essentially living in the ghetto. And when Aquaman goes to this place alongside Dolphin and meets with a handful of these people, they're ragtag, barely making ends meet. I mean, they're taking it day by day. For Aquaman, it's the darkest of times. For them, it's always been dark times. So it's kind of crazy to see like this sort of comparison between these two groups. Now, of course, this basically ends up leading to like Cadaver, one of the forces of a guy named Crush, showing up with the purpose of like tracking down, you know, these mutants, and then tracking down like quote unquote the legend of Aquaman, you know, and then looking to like secure him for his own ends, because Crush believes he knows who it is, which is kind of cool, because this leads to a really, really interesting conversation. When Aquaman is brought before Crush, Aquaman's first inclination, and even our first inclination, is to say he's a bad guy. He's a mob boss. But Crush's whole stance is it's not so clear cut. It's not so black and white. We live down here in a place where no one cares. The kings of old don't care what we do because we were always considered to be cast-offs. We're undesirables. Like, you want to pretend like we don't exist. And so because you pretend like we don't exist, we do whatever we have to do in order to make ends meet. Is it any wonder why we turn to crime? And it makes sense. But at the end of the day, Aquaman kind of sees through that facade and says, no. You can masquerade it how you want to, but you're a warlord. Like, you're nothing more than just a petty warlord using power to your own ends and just trying to hold on to that power as long as you possibly can. And so following this, Crush says, yeah, you're kind of right. Yeah, basically that's kind of true, but it doesn't take away from what he said before. And that's kind of the interesting thing about it. Now, with regards to Dolphin herself, Crush has kind of been using her as bait, and he basically says, he tells Aquaman, I know exactly who you are. Like, you can tell me that you're not the king of Atlantis, that you're not Arthur Curry, but I think you are, because you look like him. Now, this is the important thing to bear in mind. This is the 9th tribe. And so while they are aware of the king, they don't have regular dealings with him. And that's why the initial inclination, or the initial question might be, but like, it's the king of Atlantis, how do they not know what he looks like? Well, if they never meet him, how would they know what he looks like? What reason would they have to know what he looks like? He's just some disembodied figure who exists up there somewhere, and occasionally the laws he passes will affect him in some form or fashion. Like, that's basically it. So with Dan Abnett playing on that, it is a little fast and loose, but it does work. And this is where Crush comes in, because he basically says, I told you that girl was going to serve a purpose, and the purpose is she's not alone inside that tank. If you do not tell me who you are, if you do not confess to the fact that you're Aquaman, that giant beast is going to eat her. And so it's kind of cool to see, because then it's just kind of like, all right, is he actually going to let her die? Like, is he actually going to let this chick die? Ultimately, of course, Aquaman doesn't. Using his ability to talk to fish, he basically calls the thing off, and that's an admission of guilt. Because remember, Aquaman is the only person that has that power. And so because it's so unique, he might as well be walking around with giant purple letters over his head saying, I'm Aquaman, I'm the king of Atlantis. And so in that recognition, and in doing that, of course, he talks to the giant creature. They basically end up escaping, and he and Dolphin end up running off. And then, of course, Crush sends his guys after Aquaman and says, capture him, bring him back to me, and we can use him as bartering power for King Wrath in order to sort out the things that we want to sort out. Now, this is where the plot starts to thicken, and this is where Dan Abnett really stands out as a great writer, where we look at all these different things that are going on. We look at Wrath, who basically seized power. We look at Aquaman, who's in the 9th tribe, just trying to make ends meet and trying to be somewhat of a freedom fighter, but not return to his role as king. And we look at Mera, who's trying to find a way to free her husband. What we end up doing is picking up with the Silent School, these people that like practice magic. And what they start doing is they start scheming, and they start saying, well, inevitably, this is going to lead to a fight between Aquaman and Wrath. When he goes to take back the throne, Wrath will not just kneel and just hand the throne to Aquaman. It's going to be a bloody and fierce battle, and they may kill them both. And if they do, well, then the Silent School should be the ones to rise, and basically like the widowhood should be the ones to rise and should be the ones to lead. And so the question becomes, well, if we do that, then who's going to be the leader? And it's like, well, then it'll be Mera. like Mera will be the one to take over everything. So it's really, really cool because now it turns into a kind of Game of Thrones-esque situation where everyone's vying for power. Now, following this, we switch back over to Volko. And what Volko is doing here is actually pretty interesting. Volko had been contacted by a member, really her name's like Ondine, but a member of the Widowhood, basically saying like, hey, look, I'm here to guide you, protect you, to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing here, that your attempt to basically find a way to take down this crown of thorns by accessing the trident of Aquaman, that you're not going to die in the process. And so in this moment, what ends up happening is the two of them basically access the catacombs, which goes into the treasury. Now, the Treasury of Atlantis is where the trident of Aquaman's currently stationed at. The problem is it's under lock and key. Like, no one gets in or out who's not supposed to be there. And so they're basically going through the underbelly in order to work their way up to the top. The issue with this is that it's all guarded by like people who were formerly advisors to the various kings of Atlantis, and they go back a long, long ways. And this is a really, really cool moment here, because what this does is it says that like these people who end up taking up this role do so willingly, that when the time comes when they pass on, they'll basically say like, my spirit will dwell here as a protector of the underbelly in order to make sure no one can sneak into the throne or into the treasury room and steal things. And so it's a huge honor for them to have. The problem with this is that if you want to get past them, you have to be able to speak their name. If you don't, they will kill you. Now, Volko has been around for a long time. And so Volko, knowing the various names of these people, allows him and Ondine to basically make their way through and to sneak past. And so it's really kind of a cool moment here. The other half of this, and really what's kind of going on, is with Mera's inability to break through the crown of thorns that's guarding Atlantis, she goes and she seeks out Aqualad. I guess really Tempest, if you want to call him that. She goes and she seeks out Garthe. Now, I am not the most well-versed when it comes to Garthe. I don't know a whole lot about his character. Garthe was out of my wheelhouse, and I never really cared about him. Like, I was never really interested in him, so I never really had a reason to look into him. He was just kind of a character who was there that, you know, I knew existed, but that was really about it. But with Mera going to him and seeking him for aid, one of the things that he reveals here, at least is from what Dan Abnett's doing, is one of the things he says is, in the New 52, he was originally just a ward of Aquaman, and that was really it. And then from there, he was basically enrolled in the Silent School. The problem with this was that the leader of the Silent School had pushed him and another girl named Syra extremely hard, and this led to a lethal situation whereby Garthe had performed an experiment and Syra had died. And so, blaming the leader of the Silent School, Garthe left. He basically abandoned it. Now, he does remember a lot of the magical properties, a lot of the magical principles that came with his time in the Silent School, but he doesn't practice them anymore. He's basically left that part of his life behind. But Mera coming to him and saying, look, you have to help here. You're the only one that can get me through this, is basically like his loyalty to Aquaman and his loyalty to Atlantis, and then leaving and coming back and trying to help Mera as best he can. And so it's kind of a cool little scenario here, because where they're facing off against these forces of Coram Wrath, these forces of the Silent School, they do the best they can and they hold their own. But in the middle of all this, Garthe basically steals one of the amulets. Him and Mera race off because they're being outnumbered, and then in turn he gives her the amulet and says, this thing should let you through, but the problem is it's damaged. I don't know what's going to happen here. And so it's a pretty dangerous game. And so again, jumping back to Volko, there's a lot happening here. So jumping back to Volko, where he and Ondine basically go through and again start talking to these ghosts, the further they get in, the older the ghosts get, and the older they get, the more decayed they get, which means that Volko can't recognize them. And the exact scenario happens where basically one of these ghosts pop up and he has no idea who they are, and he keeps calling them by the wrong name, and he's just like, run. So they basically end up taking off. They basically just flee for their life as fast as they can. Now, ultimately, this leads to him just kind of like running off a series of names, and then ultimately realizing like he finally calls out the right name, and this one starts addressing him properly, and then actually starts talking to him, which is something that we haven't seen before. Like, from what Volko said, normally you can say their name and then they'll just leave, you know, because it's like, okay, you're allowed to be here because you're of Atlantean heritage and you know who we are, and so on and so forth. This one starts talking to him, you know, like Null just kind of starts talking to him. They start having a conversation, and when they do, Null basically leads him to the treasure room, because the two of them were really, really good friends back in their younger days. But making their way to the treasure room, this basically leads them to gathering the trident of Aquaman, which basically will give them the ability to lower down the shield. Now, from here, because of the fact that like Aquaman managed to make his escape from Crush in turn reasons that if he goes back to Coram Wrath and says, hey, look, here's everything that's going on, Aquaman is actually alive, that Coram Wrath will basically give him a pardon, or will put him in like total control of like the ninth trident, and then like send some members of the Drift down there to enforce the authority of Crush. But when he gets back up there and he goes to Commander Merc, the person who originally killed Aquaman, he says, look, I need to talk to Coram Wrath. It's about Arthur Curry. The dead king is actually alive. And like Commander Merc's response is, of course he is. And then in turn kills Crush. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, I knew it. I knew that he didn't kill Aquaman. I knew he had to be on the inside of it. I knew he had to be the reason why Aquaman was still alive, because it's the only way you can make it work. Now for Mera, once she actually leaves the ocean waters per se, and then goes directly inside of Atlantis, she immediately starts suffocating. And in reality, I'm not sure why. I'm not really sure how Dan Abnett's making this work. Like, she needs oxygen to breathe. And the reason why it's kind of strange to me is because she goes from water to water. Now there's a barrier there, but we don't know if part of the magic, and this may be what happened, if part of the magic that was imposed there is if someone left and came in that wasn't supposed to, that it takes away their ability to breathe underwater. That seems to be the effect that's going on here, but we wouldn't really know unless it was explicitly stated. It's really just kind of a crapshoot. But Mera basically starts suffocating. Now at the same time, what you also have, this is kind of a cool thing, you've also got freedom fighters. This is kind of a cool little moment here, because when you have Aquaman sort of addressing this whole thing, that you have, this group called the Undercurrent, with the rise of Coram Wrath, who's not recognized as a legitimate king. There are those who defected, those who are still loyal to Arthur Curry and say, we will continue to fight and try to overthrow Coram Wrath, and we'll do it in the name of Arthur, even though we believe he's dead. And it's kind of a cool thing, because that's how all these things happen, right? Like, the one thing that dictators fear is that someone will rise to power and take them down. And so Aquaman joins the Undercurrent, and in turn kind of gives us this interesting monologue where he says the Undercurrent are really nothing more than just farmers with pitchforks, basically, to quote the Patriot. They're not really capable here. What they need is they need structure. They need order. They need someone to transform them from essentially like a militia into like an ordered military force. And that's what Aquaman does. He sits them down and says, we have to start working together. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create an actual fighting force. And then what we're going to do is we're going to lead this fighting force directly against Coram Wrath. We're going to overthrow his reign. And then in turn, we're going to take Atlantis back. But here's the kicker. Aquaman does not want to be king. He does not want to rule Atlantis. And that's one of the things that he was kind of learning when he was spending time with Dolphin, is that Dolphin, as a girl who can't talk, has to communicate through like hand gestures and things like that. And she draws pictures of like the symbols of the Justice League, of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman recognizes those as he talks to himself and tries to figure out what she's saying. He comes to the realization that Superman, the Batman, Wonder Woman, they're not kings and queens. They're just heroes. They're protectors. And what Aquaman came to realize was that as king of Atlantis, he was ruling as a king, but not ruling as a leader. That he was essentially ruling over what he saw. He wasn't ruling over what he didn't see. And all these people down here at the bottom, all these people in the 9th Triad and the 8th Triad and these lower triads down here were all cast-offs. They were people Aquaman didn't care anything about. And so his stance is, I don't want to be a tried and true king like I was before. I want to be a leader. I want to represent all of these people, these members of the 9th Triad, all these cast-off people. And that's a great thing, because this is a veritable army. This is an untapped resource. There are countless people living down here, countless beings living down here who have all felt left out, who have all felt walked all over, who have felt like they don't matter. And then suddenly someone comes along and says, I was a king once and I lost being a king. And when I was king, what I failed to realize is how much all of you matter. So fight with me and we will overthrow the existing establishment. We'll cast off this false king and I will represent all of you guys accordingly. There is nothing, it's the one thing that Aquaman is able to tap into here, the one thing that can change the tide of everything, good or bad. It can make things worse or it can make things better. But the one thing he's tapping into is hope. Hope can be used as a weapon or it can be used as a means to inspire people to greater things. But that's the cool moment here. Aquaman is feeding on the hope of those who live down in the 9th Triad that are looking for a better life, and in turn using the hope as a means to bring all these people together to overthrow King Wrath. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.